ZombieTech. Welcome to ZombieTech, a forum for engineers, scientists, and inventors to ponder on the technologies needed to survive the inevitable zombie apocalypse.
She's Eddie.
He's Whisker.
And who do we have this week?
So this week, I have this all prepared, okay? First, we know in the last 2 weeks, I'd say last week of August, really, it's been a very sad but also celebratory time for NASA, with Neil Armstrong's passing away and Curiosity's landing. Very exciting. And today we are super honored to have an opportunity to talk to Earle Kyle, who is an aerospace engineer and physicist who has helped design. And let me just tell folks that these are just a few, like a handful of the things he has helped to design. The Apollo manned moon mission spacecraft, the SR-71 Blackbird, Phantom II fighter plane, C-5A Galaxy Starlifter, the Thor Delta missile, Skylab space station, biomedical systems for the space shuttle, I just can't even believe it, telemetry data systems for the Atlantic Missile Range, and he's been consultant to, again, these are just a handful, Goodyear Aerospace, Collins Radio, Honeywell Aerospace, Fairchild Hiller, of course, NASA. And this is the first of many entries in his LinkedIn page. Hi, Earle.
Hi.
First, thank you again for talking with us. I know when Whisker met you first at the IEEE meeting in January, his hands were shaking a little.
Well, I was a little bit, sideswept because I was just shaking hands with people, talking to people randomly after Addie gave her talk. And, this unassuming guy comes up and he's like really excited to talk to me. I'm like, okay, cool. And then he says who he is. And I'm like, oh, wow, I see.
So awesome. Let nobody say that Rochester does not have amazing engineers. So how did you end up as an engineer, and how did you end up at NASA?
Well, I like to tell this story because it's part of the thing that I do in talking to school children, where the program that I'm involved with right now, which is called the NASA Solar System Ambassadors Program. And our primary objective in that program is to inspire the next generation of space explorers. And I've done a lot of research on this because I'm going to tell you my personal story, and it'll illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. I think almost all of us at one point in our life, and sometimes it's early in life and sometimes it's a little later, have some chance happenstance occur, whether it's some movie you see or a book you read or some relative or some teacher or whatever. But something happened and suddenly it resonates with you. Some people call it the warm spot in your heart. I prefer to call it the tuning fork of the soul, because when it hits you, you just say, wow, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. Now, in my case, I was in 8th grade, and this was before the dawn of the space age, so I'm kind of telling my age. But my folks subscribed to a very large format, colorful magazine called Collier's Magazine, which is now defunct, but it was similar to Life magazine, large format, very colorful, came out once a month. And one issue came while I was in 8th grade to the house, and on the cover was this picture of the planet Mars. It was an artist's sketch, drawing, painting, with a fleet of manned spaceships flying towards it. And the article was a series that would go on for several months, written by the famous rocket scientist Werner von Braun. It knocked my socks off, and I immediately said, wow, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I tell all my teachers and my guidance counselors, and of course they all said, you're crazy, forget about it, none of that crap's ever going to happen in your lifetime, go do something practical, and so on. And so all through junior high and high school, same old, people kept laughing at me. I go to University of Minnesota and an Institute of Technology majoring in physics. And suddenly, in my second year, the Russians put the Sputnik up, and suddenly I'm not so weird anymore. And of course, the phone starts ringing off the hook because if you could fog a mirror and hold a soldering iron, they wanted your body because we were way behind the Russians in space technology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how it happened for me. And literally, I'm not kidding. I was tempted with huge offers of large sums of money to quit school and go to California and start working in the space program. And but I stayed and finished, and then I moved to California where all the action was, and that's how it got started.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point downstream, I became a consulting engineer. Some people call them contract engineers. Some people call them job shoppers, whatever the name. But yeah, you usually get an agent who books gigs for you.
Mm-hmm.
And in my first year of doing it, I booked 100,000 miles flying all over the country from one place to another, sometimes working 2 jobs at the same time. It was an incredible, highly active era. It was a golden era, which we'll probably never see again.
Mm.
So to make a long story short, then my dream finally came true, and I ended up working on the Apollo project for one of the contractors, which was Minneapolis Honeywell. And
Mm-hmm.
I was born and raised in Minneapolis, so in a sense I ended up coming back to my hometown. And Honeywell had the job of working on designing the displays in the spaceship. And sometimes if you've seen pictures of the Apollo capsule, you'll see these big ball-type things. There's twin balls. That's a flight director attitude indicator. And that tells you which way the spacecraft is pointing and when it's on its way to the moon, whether the nose is up or whether it's rolling or pitching back and forth and so forth. And also the joysticks to steer the thing if the autopilot craps out, and also the switches and the buttons to fire the little engine that, by the way, is about a third the thrust of an SR-71 Blackbird, and to make mid-course corrections on the way to the moon. So that's how it all got started. And then, as I said, because the time was so dynamic, there were so many programs going on at the same time. We had the Minuteman missile program,
Mm-hmm.
trying to catch up to the Soviets and intercontinental ballistic missiles. We had the fighter planes. We had the big monstrous C-5 Galaxy cargo heavy lifter plane that could carry a bunch of tanks and troops in its belly and all that sort of thing. And then I had the Apollo program, which of course was preceded by the stepping stones of the Mercury one-man capsule, the Gemini two-man capsule, learning how to rendezvous and all that, and then Apollo itself. So
Mm-hmm.
that's how I got started in the whole thing. And I've been involved in it, ever since, doing all kinds of things, because the other thing that was neat about it, since it was a manned program, there were the biomedical issues that were involved, and so I got involved in that, and that led to a whole lot of other things in my background.
Hmm. So did they just ask for volunteers? So who wants to work on, the biometric systems for a guy going up to the moon?
Yeah, and then, of course, I started out working on the ground support equipment, and that wasn't exciting for me. I'm kind of a funny guy. I like to feel that what I'm working on is exciting.
Sure.
And if it's not, then that's just not for me. Now, other people aren't like that, and I appreciate that, but there's just something weird about me. And so if you told me that you wanted me to design a shrimp packaging machine in a frozen food factory assembly line or something, if I was hungry enough, I'd probably do it, but I wouldn't be excited about it. So
Right.
if you say, I want you to design a manned spaceship, yeah. Where do I go? I'll pay you to work on it. So that's just the way I am. So.
Sure.
So the ground support was okay. I was in the door, but I really wanted to work on the flight hardware. So then when I got that opportunity, then, boy, I was in heaven. And then, of course, we had these horrible, well, I shouldn't say that. They were very good at keeping us on track. We'd have top-level management, vice president types would come through from time to time, and then we'd get these nasty memos I saw somebody laughing the other day. Get back to work. We were working 100-hour weeks. I mean, that was minimum. Sometimes you'd sleep on a cot in your cubicle or out in the lab, stuff like that.
Sure.
But it was fun. I enjoyed it. Best time of my life.
Sure. Now, what does it take, in your mind as an engineer to develop something that no one, no one has ever made or even come close to creating before? These days we have templates, we have other resources for, I'm going to take something super simple like the iPad. The Galaxy Nexus 7, another tablet can take apart the iPad and be like, oh, well, they did this, they did that, and then kind of finagle with it to make their own, right? So for you as a hardware designer, where do you come up with the ideas necessary to do anything?
Well, it wasn't quite that bad in the sense that it was interesting the way it was set up. What they did is they had way up at the front of the scheme of things are people who are system specification engineers. And I wasn't one of those, although a very close friend of mine was. And so I learned a lot about that. As a matter of fact, he encouraged me to go to a lot of classes, and I learned a lot. And these great big thick books about 3 inches thick, spiral bound, and printed on both sides of the page. And I had like 6 of those would be for one class and stuff. I went to a lot of night school classes on that. What they do is they say, these are the specifications. Then they had another bunch of engineers and the standards and components or something like that. I forgot the name of the group.
Mm-hmm.
But what they did is went and wrote specifications on hardware parts like microchips, resistors, capacitors, printed circuit board assemblies, that sort of thing. And what they were looking for are parts that they knew a lot about, that they had already been in, let's say, a military airplane or a missile and stuff like that. So they had all this historical reliability data so they could predict the failure rate of these parts.
Mm-hmm.
Because this was an unprecedented mission. Before I was working on Apollo, I was working on the McDonnell Douglas Phantom II F-4 fighter plane.
Mm-hmm.
I was working on the reconnaissance version of that plane, and it had a Goodyear side-looking synthetic aperture radar mapping system, and at the same time was also working on the SR-71 Blackbird's similar hardware system. And the reliability of those planes, I was shocked to find was about 67%. That was defined as a plane gets up in the air and the guy goes to fly his mission. Well, there's a 1/3 chance something's going to go wrong and he may not come back. On this program, on Apollo, it was 99 point, and I forgot how many times after the decimal point, but it was classified. This was unprecedented to make something that reliable. So that's why they wanted all these parts to be well-known and very reliable. So we had this list of qualified parts. So you had the spec, you had the bag of parts, and then it was up to you to figure out how you're going to put those parts together in the right combination to meet the performance specification. But in addition, you had a shoebox, literally sized module that all that crap had to fit into. So that was the challenge, that you had to keep the parts count small enough so it fit in the box.
Mm-hmm.
And then the box had to be, the thing had to be designed to meet all these horrible specifications, low temperature, high temperature, storage for 2 years down at Cape Canaveral with salt spray from the ocean, and all that kind of stuff, vibration, things like that. So that was the challenge. And you're right, it's stuff that hadn't been done before, but at least you had a roadmap that says these are the guidelines in which you have to do it, and these are the specs, and if it doesn't meet the specs, back to the drawing board. Oh yeah, and by the way, there's a gun to your head that says we got to get this thing done before the end of the decade, because that's what the late President Kennedy said, so that's what we're going to do. And we got wind that the Russians were going to get there first, and the idea was to beat them. So yeah, it was really quite a challenge.
Sure. Wow.
Yeah, and it was a lot more difficult then because the infrastructure wasn't actually fully in place like it is today. They
Hmm.
can work
Right.
somewhat, I wouldn't say necessarily more efficiently, but in a much more controlled fashion nowadays.
Well, yeah, it's like my youngest son right now is finishing his PhD in mechanical engineering at Columbia University in New York City,
Mm.
and we stay in touch as best as we can. But how kids are; they usually want to text or tweet or something, but rather than do what we're doing right now is talking. But at any rate, when I look at all the stuff that he's got at his disposal and the high-powered software systems and computing systems and so forth, and I look back to what I had to do in my colleagues, and we had slide rules,
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody's old enough to know even what the heck that is. And then I had a tie class that one salesman had given to me that was an actual working slide rule, which I actually used from time to time when I couldn't find my big one. I forgot it out in one of the labs or something. We had the old-fashioned um, Burroughs multi-keyboard calculator, desk calculator thing. We did have one 300 baud telephone suction cup type teletype interface to a remote mainframe computer at a company called International Timesharing that was way out in the suburb near Shakopee in a little town called Jonathan, Minnesota.
Mm.
And that's how we talked to that thing. And so we would write some software and talk to that, and then we'd get the answer back in the form of a printout, and we would have
Wow.
to then use that information to transfer it into the design spec. But it was all very, very crude, and that's why we had to work so many long hours. We worked 7 days a week, and typically 100 hours a week,
Wow.
and so a lot of times phones would be ringing in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and the wives would be calling, asking interesting questions like, "Where's the aspirin?" And the guys would bark back, "Where it always is, in the medicine cabinet." And then he'd hang up, and the train of thought would get broken, and I'd have to go all the way back and start the calculation all over again. And of course, they were checking up to make sure that these cockamamie stories about working those long hours were really true, and you weren't out at some bar someplace. But that's what it was like.
Huh.
Right, yeah, it was, and it's amazing. Of course, everybody's heard the story that the computers on the spaceship were so puny that today's digital watches have got much more horsepower than they have and stuff like that, and that's true. And it's amazing that so much code could be written in such a small amount of memory and
Hmm.
so forth. But it was
So,
fun.
so how certain, the day of the launch and the ensuing journey, like, how sure were you and the rest of the engineers of its success? Or were you guys just biting your nails the entire time?
Yeah, in my case, I was really lucky. I I was actually 2.8 miles away from the launch pad. I was standing in an area right next to the vehicle assembly building. And if you've ever seen pictures of the Cape, or if you've been there, there's this great big huge box building where they put the rockets together inside. The building's big enough that it could have held 4 Saturn V's. And to give you an idea of how big the Saturn V rocket is, it's 36 stories tall, which is about the size of a
Yeah, I was going to
medium-sized.
ask if that was the really tall building there, and yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah, it is. And that building was
Yeah, okay.
taller than 36 stories, so you could have put 4 of those things in there
Wow.
standing vertically. So that's how big that building is. But they never put that many in there. I think it mostly had 2 in there. And then there's 2 launch pads, and then there you've probably seen the movies of the big tractor thing that
Mm-hmm.
carries them vertically all the way out to the 2 launch pads, 39A and 39B, and then they place them on the pad, and then the crawler comes back. And so next to that big building, they had a VIP viewing area and a press area too.
Mm.
And so I was fortunate enough to get a pass to get in there at that spot, and I measured it on a map, and it was 2.8 miles away. Somebody told me that if we were 2.5 miles away, the sound from the rocket taking off would kill you because the shock wave would liquefy your internal organs at that range. And at 2.8, that's okay. Well, I'm a little worried about that. Also, the amount of fuel on board was enough to be equivalent of a small atomic bomb, so that was another reason they didn't
that's
want
reassuring.
Yeah. Now, let me put this in perspective. The first stage of the thing has 5 big F-1 rocket engines, and in the early days of the program when von Braun and his team at Huntsville, Alabama, at the Marshall Space Flight Center was developing that thing, they tested one of those engines outdoors, just one of them. They fired the thing up, and it broke windows 40 miles away, and it caused an earthquake. So they said, well, we can't do this anymore because it's costing us tons of money for all these insurance claims that people were knocking at the door saying, you broke my window.
Sure.
So now, to this very day, they test big engines like that down in the swamps in lower Mississippi at the Stennis Space Flight Center that NASA has down there, and then the swampy, marshy land absorbs those shockwaves. Now, can you imagine 5 of those things all starting up at the same time? So that was what I was, and I knew this story, see, so I'm thinking to myself, and I had a 35-millimeter film camera, and I climbed up on a bleacher so I could be above the crowd. There was a lot of people standing in this area, and the former First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, was there, and the Vice President of the United States was there, and the Emperor Haile Selassie from the country of Ethiopia was there, a whole lot of dignitaries and a lot of press people. So it was really kind of crowded in this little area. And then there were these trailers with all the Walter Cronkite, CBS News, and all those people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm up on these bleachers, like the kind of bleachers you have at a high school football stadium. And I wanted to get up on the top one, and I rested my back against the backboard, and I held the camera, and the thing lit up. And I got this big countdown clock that you might have seen, and there's loudspeakers counting it down. And you can hear the Capcom and Neil Armstrong and those guys. And finally it counts down, and then it says ignition. And it was 9:20 in the morning. It was a beautiful sunny day, and the sun was off to my right at about, I don't know, maybe 30-degree angle up from the horizontal, and maybe 20 degrees off to my right. The rocket now is almost straight ahead of me. And when that thing lit up, it was a little pinpoint of light at 2.8 miles away. And instantly it felt like a blowtorch in your face. The heat was incredible. Of course, heat travels at the speed of light, so it got there almost instantly. But there was no sound because at that 2.8 miles, it takes 14.7 seconds for the sound to reach. And the first thing I said, I had a tape recorder running because I wanted to record this historic event. When I played it back later, I could hear myself saying, hey, what's wrong? I don't hear nothing. And then it dawned on me, you dummy, the sound, was going to take 14 or so seconds to reach you at that distance. Wow. And then suddenly there's this lagoon between where I was and the launch pad, and you can see the shock wave coming across the water. Yeah, and birds flying out of the way and everything. And then it hit. The shock wave hit, and it was like being punched in the gut by a prize fighter. But there was this beat frequency between the 5 engines, so there was this staccato kind of a bang, 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 bang like that. And each one of those bangs was like the cannon in the 1812 overture going off. It was incredibly loud. The ground was shaking. The bleacher was jumping up and down. The backboard was going back. I could hardly hold the camera still. I did get a very nice picture of it taking off, and then it slowly lifts. That thing weighs about 6.5 million pounds. It develops at the beginning 7.5 million pounds of thrust. So it's just sitting there, struggling to get up. So it's really slow when it goes up. So the show lasts a long time. And then as it burns off more fuel, it gets lighter and lighter. Then it starts to accelerate. And as it rises up, this sound just rains down on you. It's just absolutely incredible. And by the way, just to illustrate how emotional this experience is, outside the gate 10 miles away was a whole bunch of protesters saying we should quit wasting this money on it. We got all these poverty, people and poor people, and we need to spend the money on social programs. And they interviewed them right after the launch was over. Every single one of them did a 180 and said, "Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah, go." They had completely forgotten what they were there protesting. They became fans of the thing.
Sure.
And can you imagine it 10 miles away? It did that to them. You can imagine what it did for those of us who were only 2.8 miles away. It's absolutely incredible. And let me just reinforce this one point. Some years later, I was there for the last test flight of the shuttle, same spot. This was STS-4. The first 4 missions only had 2 guys on board, and they didn't have anything. They were just testing it out. So I'm there at that last STS-4, the 4th mission. Develops the same amount of thrust, but the darn thing is only about a third the size and the weight of the Apollo. And as a consequence, it's gone like a bat out of Hades. Goes boom, bang, and it's over with. It's very disappointing. So it's too bad that today's generation can't go down and experience something like that. Biggest rocket man that ever built, and nobody's ever built anything as big as that since. Although we did have a program, but got canceled not too many a couple of years ago, but which would have been a rocket 40% larger than that. So that would have really been a shame.
Wow.
Probably couldn't have stood outside the V8 vehicle assembly building for that guy. You'd have to be further back. But
Sure.
yeah, I'll tell you, everybody's, I think, has some earth-shaking, no pun intended, experience in their life, and that was mine. I mean, and yeah, I was worried. I thought, is it going to blow up? Is it going to work? Are they going to have to cancel it? Stuff like that. And it was just perfect. It just went off, and everything worked.
And to this day, even with the missions now, there's always that. Is the weather going to play well, and all these other factors that they're always talking about constantly in the hours leading up to it. I mean, we watch a lot of the launches here, and it's always sort of nail-biting to see if they're actually going to go off without a hitch.
So, gosh. So, and I know I could talk about this all day, but we do have what you're doing now these days, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier in terms of being a solar ambassador.
Right.
And when we first met, you were also talking about setting up STEM schools. So for those who don't know, that's science, technology, engineering, and math.
Right.
Are those two connected at all?
Yes, but it's somewhat loosely connected, and the way that started was back on the last Apollo launch, the Apollo 17, which, by the way, was the only launch at night. At this time in my life, I had started a nonprofit, well, I was a co-founder and then eventually president of a nonprofit organization called Minds for Progress, and our charter was to try to answer the call from the University of Minnesota to get more women and minorities involved in engineering, and also to help retain them. And so I was pitching for reaching them at the kindergarten level, which today people are doing with the National STEM Initiative. But the local educators in the Twin Cities said no, and they said, well, we compromised on about the 8th grade level, which was okay for me, by the way, because that's when I got inspired by that Collier's Magazine article.
Sure.
So we took a bunch of inner-city kids from Minneapolis, St. Paul area at no cost to them down to watch the Apollo 17 from that same spot that I stood for the first man-moon mission. But this one was at night. And I know we don't have time to go into that, but it was even more awesome because it was December 7th, the Pearl Harbor Day, 1972, shortly after midnight when this thing finally took off. It had a little bit of a delay. And it was misty and foggy out, so as this bright flame rises up into the air, and because of the mist and the effect, it looked like a Star of Bethlehem rising up into the sky. And then, of course, the sound raining down. It just knocked us out. And then we took these kids to a VIP reception that NASA hosted. So that's how I got started with collaborating with NASA and other organizations to try to fill the pipeline with more youngsters that normally wouldn't consider a career in engineering or science or technology. So I've been working on that a long time. About 10 years ago or so, NASA started this program called the Solar System Ambassadors Program, And I joined that when I was living out in New York. And so I've been doing that for about the last 10 years. And there's about 500 of us all over the United States. I think there are about half a dozen of us in Minnesota or less. Of course, New York has a whole lot of them. And some of them are out where our troops are, like in Germany, we've got people there. Or anywhere there's troops in a school for their families, then there would be a solar system ambassador. So they're in Hawaii and Guam and
Neat.
Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and so forth. And every month, or we have at least one, sometimes 3 or 4 teleconferences with scientists and engineers, mostly from the Jet Propulsion Lab, which is the lab out at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. And that's NASA's biggest lab that does all the robotic missions, like the rover that just landed on Mars a couple of weeks ago, Curiosity. That was still managed by JPL. So every month we have these teleconferences, and we get the latest information on all these different missions that are going on, which we then can use in our own way that we want to tailor-make presentations for local schools and things, or any other kind of activity.
Wow.
I belong to a local astronomy club here in Rochester. I also work very closely with the Mayo High School Planetarium, which, by the way, is one of the leading ones in the nation in terms of its high-tech equipment.
Nice.
And Larry Muscati is the director there, so he and I work together on a lot of programs. Sometimes I pinch it for him and teach some of his astronomy classes at the local high schools and things like that. And so we do outreach things like, whether it be the transit of Venus kind of a thing, and I'll help with that and so forth. And or I go and do a lecture at a school. I've done even as low as kindergarten age, although I prefer 8th grade and up. And we do hands-on things. I have a program where I encourage kids to, I call it the House of the Future program, build models of what they think a Mars base would look like, and all the different facets of things you have to worry about, the air support system, the food support system, the lighting system, everything.
Sure.
And transportation and so on. And then how would you transfer that technology back to the underdeveloped world here on Earth to make life better for them? So it addresses both sides of the picture in terms of not only the space age stuff, but also the earthbound stuff. So that's what I've been doing. And in the course of doing that, I've run into some schools. Like there's a school up in Minneapolis called the Minnesota School of Science, the new STEM Academy. So I was instrumental in helping that through all the planning meetings get started and the approval of the school board up there. I've worked with the Farnsworth Aerospace Middle School and elementary school up in St. Paul, Minnesota, and getting their programs off the ground. I'm working with a STEM academy here in Rochester called the Rochester STEM Academy, helping develop some of their curriculum and so forth. I've also done this with other schools out.
It seems like you're a really good guy to call to get something off the ground in general.
Yeah, that's a good pun. I'll take that. Yeah, actually, right now I'm working with some kids in Baltimore, and high school and college level. There's 2 groups that are in touch with each other, and one of them is involved in the Google Lunar X Prize, which is the $30 million prize for the first team that privately funded to put a robot rover on the moon.
Sure. And
the other group are trying to develop a new kind of an aerospace vehicle. So, and I'm not just got off the line with them not too long ago, just a few minutes ago. So yeah, I work with a lot of organizations and schools across the country, and it's a mixture of my private consulting activity and also my NASA Solar System Ambassador activity. It's very rewarding, and I appreciate doing it.
Sure.
The most interesting one was there's a school up in Minneapolis, which is a unique one in the state of Minnesota. It's called the Purpose Center for Arts Education. And this past fall, we were the first time to start what they call an art science program, which was developed at Harvard a few years ago. There are only 3 such centers in the United States: Boston, where Harvard is, Minneapolis, and Oklahoma City. The rest of them are in Paris and England and Ireland and Saudi Arabia, South Korea, New Zealand, and Singapore, and so forth. And and every year they have an international competition. And Larry Muscati at the planetarium here at Mayo High School and I were involved in mentoring one of those group of kids, and our little team actually won the local competition and went to Paris in the spring of this year to get involved. And their project was to build a portable Mars Dome planetarium simulator for inner city schools that couldn't afford field trips with all the cutbacks, so they could move this thing around. And they have venture capitalists come in and help productize their innovation and then launch it out into the marketplace. So it's very interesting activity. So I really enjoyed that. And I'm going to be working with them again this school year too.
Fascinating. So what's the biggest difference in terms of curriculum between, say, a STEM school and your typical public school?
Well, it's an interesting thing that you mentioned, because there's a new acronym that I had never heard of before until I started working with the Purpose people, and they said, well, we want to call it STEAM. So they added an A in there, and the A is for art. So it's science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. And in terms of the curriculum difference, it's like every subject is steeped somehow in technology. Now, the example I mentioned, the Farnsworth Aerospace School up in St. Paul, that's a magnet school. It's not a charter school. But all the charter schools are still part of the public school system. They get their funding from whatever the district funds are. The only difference is they have more latitude and can do whatever they want in terms of the kind of teachers they hire and the curriculum they develop. There's lots of beautiful flexibility. I love it. And Farnsworth was unique in this regard, in that they cut them some slack. I mean, the guy Troy Vincent, who was the principal up there, what a dynamite guy he is. So everything, whether it be a poetry class, an English class, an art class, or whatever, there was some way they would bake in the technology aspect. If you walked into Farnsworth Aerospace, you'd see model planes hanging all over the place from the ceiling, even if it was an English class. You see, it's that kind of a thing. So kids are constantly thinking about technology, and then of course they get involved in the robotics competitions and any other related kinds of thing, rocket clubs, stuff like that. So there's this constant look at how technology influences your life and so forth.
And for any of you listeners out there that have kids in school age, you should definitely look into charter schools. It is absolutely well worth any of the hoops you have to jump through to get your kids in there.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. Or, if you can't, then to just lean on the school that you are in to see what you can do. Because the majority of the schools that I work with, I've worked with about 300 schools across the United States. And because I have consulting operations all across the country, and so with that liaison, I can, by remote control, develop programs for schools. So most of the schools I work with are regular public schools, and by having them understand that for no charge to them at all, which is usually the showstopper, the budgetary issue, they can get all this program stuff from the NASA Solar System Ambassador Program. So we can provide them materials, hands-out, literature, a website, help them develop things like that, lectures, PowerPoint presentations that they can do themselves with their own digital projector equipment, things like that. So it's very easy for even a regular public school to have programs like that.
Sure. Now it's interesting because these days when I think of space travel or anything having to do with space exploration, really, I think commercial. Because it feels like things have changed. To the layperson, I think it feels like things have changed from where the government is funding these endeavors to where we have companies like SpaceX. Right.
Right.
So then as a solar ambassador and also as a former NASA engineer, are you guys a little cranky about the fact that it's started going commercial?
Not really. And let me answer the question this way. A long time ago, within the NASA community, there was this warfare between the robotic people and the manned spacecraft people.
Hmm.
And the reason was that the manned spacecraft, because the human being is so fragile, you got to have all this life support equipment, and the reliability has to be so high because you don't want to kill them. We've already been to that movie before. And for a robot, the reliability, yes, you want it to be good because you spend a lot of money on the thing, and but it doesn't have to be that good. So they always were the little man on the totem pole budget-wise, and they were very jealous of it. And they fought tooth and nail with each other throughout the years. And then finally it dawned on them, both sides, that we need each other. Here's why. The robot people made discoveries that the man people didn't know. For example, if you go back and dig out those old Collier's magazine articles that Von Braun wrote, and all those pictures that he drew, he didn't know what Mars's atmosphere was like. He thought it was much thicker than it really is. So he shows big winged craft landing on Mars like airplanes. Well, that's just ridiculous. The air is so thin that the wings would have to be like 10 to 50 times bigger than what he drew, and there's no material that would support its own weight, even in the one-third gravity of Earth's gravity that Mars has.
Mm-hmm.
So the roboticists find stuff that we didn't know. For example, our first satellite, Explorer 1, discovered the deadly radiation Van Allen belts that surround the Earth. If you put our space station that's up there right now at the wrong altitude, this guy's would be toast in about an hour. So they always fly below it or above it, and if you're going someplace to the moon, you go through it quick. We didn't know that, so that's what they bring to the table. The manned people, because of their requirements for high reliability, bring ultra reliability to the program, and that's why, as I speak, the Voyager craft that's on its way to the stars has been working perfectly for 35 years.
Mm-hmm.
And still going strong
Mm-hmm.
because it's using very high reliability parts. The Cassini school bus-sized robot vehicle that's circling Saturn right now has been working for over 12 years right now, still going strong, and because it's got high reliability parts. So at one point, they buried the hatchet and realized that it's each side feeds the other in the manner that I described. And I suspect that at some point, yes, there are some people that are disgruntled about the cutbacks in NASA, and the people on the private side, like Burt Rutan, who won the Ansari X Prize for the first suborbital private spaceships, always grumble about all the FAA regulations and government red tape and stuff like that. But at some point, they'll come to the same meeting of the minds that we need each other.
Mm-hmm.
And SpaceX, by the way, has got its coffers full of NASA contracts. And one of the teams that I mentor on the road, the Google Lunar X Prize at Carnegie Mellon University, where I used to be, they got a lot of their funding for some side work by contracts from NASA to make robots to explore and look for ice in the craters on the polar regions of the moon to support future moon colonies, for manned moon colonies, things like that. So they all complement each other, and I'm not too worried about that. I think it's an exciting time that we live in right now. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
It seems to me one of the benefits of the commercial stuff that's coming up now is that they can sort of take over some of the aspects that NASA has gotten down and they know how to do, and it's really expensive to do, and they would rather be focusing on pushing forward and doing new things rather than just focusing on lifting cargo up all day.
Right. Right.
So then how about, I think one of the engineers we know mentioned the Mars to Stay program. I know since Mars is a big reason as to why you got into engineering in the first place. Any thoughts on that particular program?
I didn't catch what you were saying. Which Mars program are you
It's Buzz Aldrin's Mars to Stay. I don't know if it's an actual program or if it's just an idea.
Oh, well, Buzz has got he has several private companies that he started, and one of them is he's got this scheme of a sort of like a big figure eight where there'll be this constant vehicles that go around the Earth and then go out and go around Mars and come back again. And so then you go up and you rendezvous with that, and it takes you out there. So that he's got a company that focuses on that and several others. But the person who's the biggest advocate for manned Mars mission is a guy named Robert Zubrin. He's an aerospace engineer that used to work at Lockheed Martin out in the Denver, Colorado area. And he's written a series of books. Right? If you really want to know all the things in minute detail that we will have to overcome to successfully establish a manned colony on Mars, you have to read Robert Zubrin, and he's the founder of the Mars Society. I love his books because being a fan of manned Mars colonization, going back to that Colliers magazine that started me, sparked my juices flowing. This guy has really done his homework. Now, a lot of people disagree with some of the things that he's written, thinking that he brushes over some of the things a little too briefly. And then, of course, as each day goes on, we learn something new that we didn't know about Mars. And so a lot of his books were written, 2 or 3 years ago, and they're sort of out of date in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
This rover that we have up there right now is nuclear powered, and therefore we don't have to worry about it running out of gas, so to speak, with a dust storm, which all the previous things were solar powered, and that was a big problem. And of course, we can run at night with this guy,
Mm-hmm.
Which you can't do with the other one, and because they want to do some experiments with ultraviolet light emitting diodes to look for fluorescent rock, mineral rocks, and things like that. And we're learning new things that we didn't know before, and we also want to understand why is Mars the way it is right now? Because there's plenty of evidence that it used to have a thicker atmosphere, it was much warmer, and lakes and rivers and oceans flowed on the thing. Previous robots have definitely proven and touched. There is ice, water ice, in addition to carbon dioxide ice, dry ice. So there's plenty of water on Mars, and it used to be, rich. We hope to find evidence of life there, and of course, with all that material there, if we do send humans, see plenty of material to support a colony there. So that, but there's still obstacles to overcome, and I don't have time to list all of those, but that's the challenge. It was like, beat the Russians to the moon. That was the challenge. Hadn't been done before. This is what the next generation has to look forward to, the challenge of overcoming all these obstacles on setting up a colony on Mars, and I'm completely confident that those who are dedicated to it will figure out a way to overcome all these obstacles. It'll be an exciting thing to watch.
And the topic of what you need to support human life is something we talk about pretty much every single episode of this show. All the engineers and whatnot that come on, and we're just using the zombie apocalypse as sort of a metaphor to be able to bring up these sort of topics, like how do you get clean water? How do you make sure your air is good? How do you deal with, medical problems if you're completely separated from an existing infrastructure? And the guy's working on getting people.
Well, space is about as
that's we think a zombie apocalypse is bad. Space is worse because you've got no resources there except what you bring with you and what you can find when you get there.
Right.
Yeah. Well, almost every one of my presentations, I talk about what it would take, as a future to set up a future colony, and I explain in each one of these issues, the food, the water, the waste disposal, and I tell kids, I said, that's the challenge for you. Let me give you just a couple of them briefly. Earth has a pretty good magnetic field which deflects the charged particles that come from the sun with solar flares. Mars used to have one. There's evidence of that, but it doesn't have a magnetic field now. And by the way, that's one of the mysteries. Our magnetic field comes from a liquid rotating iron core, and you get a dynamo effect with that moving iron and the electrons that are in that liquid core, and that generates a magnetic field. Once people thought that the Mars core froze, but now we know, no, it's still liquid. So now the mystery is, what happened to shut off its magnetic field? When you don't have a magnetic field, then the charged particles can come from the sun and directly smash into the atmosphere, and that's why Mars has such a thin atmosphere, because it was actually abraded away by the solar wind. So Mars currently has an atmosphere only 1% of Earth, so it's real thin. If you stand on the surface of Mars, and by the way, it doesn't have an ozone layer either, because it's mostly carbon dioxide now in the atmosphere. if you stood on the surface of Mars, and if you could, in a bikini bathing suit, in about an hour, you would die from the ultraviolet radiation from the sun because there's no ozone layer to stop the UV. Even though you're further from the sun, you're 35 million miles further out than the Earth is from the sun. Right? And so that's a problem. And then you don't have that magnetic field, so you got all these charged particles, and galactic cosmic rays come smashing straight on through that thin atmosphere, don't get deflected. They're like an iron atom with some electrons stripped off. And each one of those hitting you would be about the equivalent of getting hit by a 100-mile-an-hour league baseball in the chest, and you actually would feel it. So radiation is a problem. Ultraviolet radiation is a problem. Thin atmosphere with no oxygen is a problem. You got to wear a spacesuit. And I go on, and then, low gravity. We know that in reduced gravity in the space station, the bone density starts to go away. Your muscles atrophy and things like that. It takes about 6 to 9 months to get to Mars. With that long a trip, you're going to lose a heart tone, muscle tone, bone mass. When you step off onto the 1/3 Earth gravity on the Mars surface, you might break a hip. All these problems have to be solved. And there aren't any trees on Mars to chew up and make wood pulp and make toilet paper. So what are you going to do about that? So I tell the kids, these are all the things you're going to have to address. And somebody's going to figure it out.
Do they ever get discouraged?
Yes, but rarely. Every once in a while there will be a kid who will throw up his hand at the Q&A part, saying, there's so many problems. Why the heck do we want to go? Hey, if you don't get it, there's nothing I can say to convince you that this is exciting and you want to meet the challenge. But most of the kids I ask at the beginning.
Tell them to escape from the zombies. They'll appreciate
right.
that. Why do you need to go to Mars? To escape from the zombies on Earth.
That's a good point. Well, I've had some kids, say, well, how can we get all the people from Earth up onto Mars? I said, well, that's not the point. We just want a few. We just want to establish a colony. So that if we screw up this planet, at least the human race will survive. So that's sort of Stephen Hawking's argument for manned space travel.
Sure.
I can definitely get behind that one. But at the end of each one of these shows, we ask a couple of questions. And you know what? It's basically the same questions that you ask of those kids.
Yep. Slightly
different, situation, but we ask every single guest a couple of questions here.
These are the real ZombieTech podcast questions.
I am absolutely. I want to hear the answers on these. This should be good.
Right. Okay. So, top 3 tools you would bring to a zombie apocalypse bunker, and it could very well be a Mars colony. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess I would bring everything I would need for a Mars colony to the bunker. And probably would definitely want some kind of a high-powered laser like the one that's on the Curiosity rover right now that can zap a rock and then look at its spectrum with a spectrographic telescope. Maybe I'd want to zap a zombie from that distance and then analyze its composition to figure out a way to take them out somewhere.
Excellent. So zombie zapper, got it. And you get 2 more.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess I'd want a containment structure similar to what I'd need on Mars that would prevent them from breaking into the place. Okay. And then I'd want a Mars life support system so that I wouldn't have to worry about going outside. So I'd have a hydroponic module and would grow my own food and recycle my wastewater and so forth. So I wouldn't run out of water.
Nice. Yeah, well, I'm going to send you our coordinates to our zombie apocalypse bunker. So whenever you get all those things, feel free to come on over.
We've got storage space for all of those things here. Yeah. I wouldn't mind one of those power packs they put on the Curiosity. That seems like it would be handy.
A little nuclear powered.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. It lasts for about 14 years.
The thermoelectric effect is pretty cool stuff. I know it's not very efficient, but it's a really neat technology.
It is, yeah. And a lot of people are worried, it's plutonium, but it's plutonium-238. It's not the kind you use to make an atomic bomb. So the radiation is easily contained within the canister, and it generates a nice, smooth, predictable power. It's got about an 87-year half-life. So This particular one will last for about 14 years with the sufficient power to drive this 1-ton rover wherever they want to go. So even though the mission is for 2 Earth years, we are expecting it to last for at least 10 to 14 and maybe longer years.
Awesome.
So yeah, I'd like one of those in the bunker too. So I got a 4th item.
Hey, we'll take it. We'll take it. And then the one book you would bring to the bunker.
Yeah, I'd bring the NASA Bioastronautics Data book. It was published in about 1962. It's out of print. You can get them at libraries, but man, that got everything in it that you'd ever want to know about the whole human body. So that would be a good general purpose tool for medical emergencies and things like that. And also learn the limits of what you can see and things with visual acuity issues, how much waste you're going to be generating from the body, stuff like that.
Wow.
It's a great book. I love that book. I used it a lot in my career.
Fantastic.
All right, Earle. So where can people find information on these STEM schools that you're working on now?
Well, if you just type the Google, STEM and Minnesota, and you'll find various schools like the Rochester STEM Academy in Rochester, the Minnesota School of Science, and there are STEM academies popping up all across the nation. Or they can contact me directly. My website addresses are lengthy and clunky, so
we'll put a link to those in the description for you.
Yep.
Okay. Well, the easiest way is to just go to Google and type Earle with an E on the end, Kyle, Kyle, and then type NASA, and that'll take you to several of my websites.
Yep. And Earle is also on Twitter at Solar Ambassador. Well, kind of. It's Solar Ambassador 1. So no R, but a 1.
Yeah, a number 1. Right?
Yep. So fabulous.
So thank you for joining us this week on ZombieTech, Earle. It's not. We get to talk to a lot of really interesting and really smart people, but you just sort of push the caliber up quite a few marks there.
Yep. So
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I enjoyed it.
ZombieTech.tv. You can subscribe to the RSS feed with your phone, your iTunes, whatever. It'll automatically get downloaded every single week. You can also watch it right on the webpage or listen to it as it were. There's a nice play button there. Real easy. We'll be back next week. Until then, bye.
bye.